Okay, well we're gonna try to cover 3 chapters this morning. So hang on to your seats here. Okay. Um, all right. So remember last week we learned that Yahweh listened to Israel's cry and revealed His choice for their first king, right? And I got dog fur in my thing here. All right. So now we come into kind of a weird lull in the story. I say weird because it's just a little bit. We're right in the middle of that change, and it seems like nobody quite knows what's going on. So at this point, Saul is anointed king, but not everybody has bought into it. There were some dissenters, and that's where we left off last week. And actually, Saul himself was reluctant to take the role. Remember, because he was hiding around the baggage, and he still wasn't quite grasping all the significance of the event. And so the next time, today, when we see Saul, he's actually out in the field plowing behind his father's oxen. So Saul the king went back to doing what he knew, right? That's pretty interesting. He went back and he was plowing the field. And so that's where we pick it up in chapter 11 here. And in verse 1 it says, And Nahash the Ammonite came up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, Cut a covenant with us, and we will serve you. But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, I will cut it with you on this condition, that I will gouge out your right eye of every one of you, and thus I will make it a reproach on all Israel. Then the elders of Jabesh said to him, Let us alone for 7 days, that we may send a messenger throughout the territory of Israel. Then if there is no one to save us, we will come to you. So this is the event that sparks everything. We're in this kind of, like I said, kind of this middle ground, and God allows this to happen to test Israel, and to also to show them give the confirmation that Saul is his king. So Jabesh was located, when you look at a map of Israel and you see the Jordan River, the territories on the eastern side of the Jordan River is what we call the Transjordan area, and Gad is located on that side. So you have Gad and Reuben. So you have Gad and Reuben would be on the right side, or on the eastern side of the Jordan, and just to the east of them is Ammon. So Ammon are these people who are led by King Nahash, who are threatening Israel. Remember, at this time too, Israel was at a low point. Saul had just become king. Israel was deep into idolatry. Remember what happened all through the judges. They would fall back into idolatry, and the judges would judge them again and rescue them, and they'd fall back into idolatry. Well, this was really a low point. And King Nahash was wreaking havoc. He was wreaking havoc on their eastern border, and he was the king of the Ammonites. Remember who the Ammonites were? Where did they come from? Anybody? Lot, right? Exactly. Yeah, Lot's daughters, after they evacuated Sodom and Gomorrah. When they evacuated that area, what happened is his daughters, they went into a cave, they went in hiding, and the daughters had incestuous relationships with them, right? So we have, one was the family of the Ammonites, and the other one was the family of the Moabites. And so they were actually distant cousins of the Jews. But they were known for their cruelty and hatred of Israel. They hated Israel. In fact, Amos 1:13 says that after conquering cities, the Ammonites would go around and rip up in the stomachs of the pregnant women. That's what they were noted for. Do you remember who the god of the Ammonites was? Anybody? Who was the infamous god of the Ammonites? The one that even eventually Israel would be involved in their idolatry later. What's that? Baal is, they're very similar, but particularly his name was Molech. Molech was the god that they would sacrifice their children to, and the Ammonites, that was their god. That was their, and so they were not only a very vicious people, but their false god, they would sacrifice their children to him. In fact, God said, until the iniquity of the Amorites was complete, Amorites were complete. This is the Ammonites here, but these were people who were they hated Israel, and so what they were doing is it said that they would gouge out the right eye, and of all these people, and gouging out the right eye was a real symbol of shame and humiliation. It was even better to them than the killing their enemies. It would show all the other nations that Ammon had conquered them and humiliated them, ultimately wanting to make them slaves. There's an interesting introduction to the book of Samuel, and it's found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everybody's familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls? They found them in this cave buried out in this area called Qumran. And in this introduction, it says, Nahash, king of Ammon, would put hard pressure on the descendants of Gad and the descendants of Reuben, and would gouge out everyone's right eye, but no rescue was provided for Israel. And there was not left anyone among the children of Israel in the Transjordan area whose right eye, Nahash, king of Ammon, did not gouge out. So we have a historical record, and this is later confirmed in our narrative here, that Ammon had already been doing this. He'd already gone through this area, and there's a bunch of people with their right eye missing. And it says that, but behold, 7,000 men escaped the power of the Ammonites, and they arrived at Jabesh Gilead, and about a month later, Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. So after doing all this havoc, then they finally besieged this primary city of Jabesh Gilead that's located in kind of the northern Gad area. And also, we have more extra biblical evidence from Josephus too, and we're going to see this later. So the threat from King Nahash of Ammon is actually what predicated the cry for Israel. This is why Israel cried out for a king, is because of Ammon. And we see here in verse 3, it says, then the elders of Jabesh said to him, let us alone for 7 days, that we may send messengers throughout the territory to see if someone would save us. And so this was typical. This is how the tribes would run. They were run by local authorities, just like our states. They were a local elder board. And this was just typical of the government at that time. But little does Nahash know that Israel has just become a monarchy. So he didn't know that. He thought everything was still operating the same way, and now Israel is a monarchy. So in verse 4 it says, then the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul, which is Saul's hometown, and spoke these words in the hearing of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept. So here, the news comes out. They're looking for help, and the people start weeping. They hear what's going on. And verse 5, it says, now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen. So here's Saul the king, and he still hasn't figured it out. I mean, he's still, he's going back to doing what he's doing. And so he's in the field behind the oxen. He says, what is the matter with this people? Why do they weep? And it says, so they recounted to him all the words of the men of Jabesh. So this is how King Saul begins to become king. And in verse 6 it says, then the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he burned with anger exceedingly. And this is the Spirit of God coming upon him for what? What did the Spirit of God come upon people in the Old Testament for? What's that? For a purpose, right? Came upon him for a purpose and a mission. And this was Saul's mission. This was what God had intended Saul to do. And the Spirit came upon Saul. And verse 7, those very oxen that he was plowing the field with, it says he took a pair of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of messengers. So he's plowing, he hears this news, the Spirit of God comes upon him, and he hacks these oxen up. And he says, whoever does not come after Saul and after Samuel so shall it be done to his oxen. Right? That's a pretty strong message. We're going to take away your means of feeding yourself and the means of doing work in your town and in your home. I'm going to do that unless you follow me. Okay? So and it says, then the dread of Yahweh fell on the people, and they came out as one man. So this is a significant change. This is something that Israel wasn't used to. This is a different government. And so Saul, he exercises his prerogative as a king now. He is a king. And Israel has just experienced their first draft, right? They never had a military draft like this before. But remember what Samuel said? You want a king? You're gonna go fight wars for him, right? And it says, in verse 8 that he numbered them in Bezek, which is about 30 kilometers west of Jabesh. And so Jabesh, Gilead's here, and Gad, and they're across the Jordan, just pretty much straight across. And the sons of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah were 30. So he summons all these people, and this is not something that happens overnight. You imagine takes time to do that, and they organize in Bezek. And they said to the messenger who had come to them, and said, Thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow, by the time the sun is hot, you will have salvation. So the messengers went and told the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Then the man of Jabesh said, tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good in your eyes. So the men of Jabesh were pretty excited about the new government, I think, right? They like the idea of a Israeli army coming to save them. No longer are the tribes independent. No longer are they on their own, but now they have a national army. In verse 11 it says, the next morning Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they went and they came into the midst of the camp at the morning watch, and they struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that not 2 of them were left. So they pretty much went in there and just wiped them out. Then in verse 12 he says, then the people said to Samuel, who is he that said, this is actually plural, there's more than one, but who is he that said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that we may put them to death. So remember last week we talked about there were some dissenters. There were some that didn't, were saying, who is this Saul that he should be king over us? But it continues in verse 14. Then Samuel said to the people, come and let us go to Gilgal. Verse 13. But Saul said, not a man shall be put to death this day, for today Yahweh has accomplished salvation in Israel. So even though these dissenters, were called out by the people to be executed, we see this side of Saul again, right? What do we see of Saul? We see a side of humility and a side of mercy. And while the people wanted to credit Saul with this victory, and while they wanted Saul to, take care of these dissenters, he doesn't do that. He doesn't take offense, but he gives recognition to Yahweh, right? In verse 14, it says, then Samuel said to the people, come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. And so all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before Yahweh in Gilgal. Remember, Gilgal is kind of their religious center. It was probably a building and not a city. So they went there, and this is where they went before the Lord, and here they recognized Saul as their king. And they also offered sacrifices of peace and offerings before Yahweh. Then Saul and all the men of Israel were exceedingly glad. Right? So God had empowered Saul with the Holy Spirit, and Saul went out and did what that God intended to do. Right? Even though he was already king prior, and he's had several times there where he was confirmed as being the king, but at this time is really where we see this kind of final confirmation. This is a religious or a spiritual confirmation, and later there's going to be another one where he's going to go before all the people. But God choosing Saul God always uses events to confirm his choice, right? We see that all through Scripture. In this case, the defeat of Ammon is what confirms Saul as being the king. Even the dissenters at this time would acknowledge him as being the king. So we get to verse 12, and now we have Samuel's turn. This is Samuel. So we we're right here, and this is the major transition point of the government. This is the official transition of power. What we would have is when our presidents do this peaceful transition of power. And we have this going on here. And in verse 1 of chapter 12, it says, Then Samuel said to all Israel, Behold, I have listened to your voice in all that you said to me, and I have appointed a king over you. So Samuel heard their cry, and Yahweh told him, Go ahead. We're gonna give him a king, and this is what happened. In verse 2 he says, Now here is this king walking before you, but I am old and gray, and behold, my sons are with you. And I want you to remember that my sons are with you, and why he said that. And he says, And I have walked before you from my youth even to this day. So Samuel says, To this day I have walked before you. And what that means is basically Saul has led them. He has functioned on their behalf. He has been their deliverer. And Samuel has judged Israel from his youth. He said, I have judged Israel from my youth to this very day. So Saul's time of judgment from his youth to that day that's the span of his time as being a judge. But now he says, I am old and I need to give it up. Somebody else has got to take it now. And remember, he said in there, and my sons are with you. Typically, what they would have thought is that they would have thought that as judge, the power of judge would have gone to his sons, right? But we'll find out later about his sons. So he's saying Saul is now the deliverer of Israel. Saul is now the leader of Israel. And in verse 2, Samuel, he said, My sons are with you. And remember, looking back at chapter 8, verse 3, remember what were Saul's sons? What was their reputation? Yeah, they had a bad reputation, right? And even Samuel was reminded about that they weren't, that his sons were very much like the previous priest's sons, huh? And in verse 8, chapter 8, verse 3, it says, Samuel's sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after greedy gain and took bribes and caused justice to turn aside. So Saul's sons didn't have a good reputation. Israel recognized that, and they saw that this was going to be a problem. So in verse 3, Samuel is going to address this, and he says in verse 3, Here I am, bear witness against me before Yahweh and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? This is, he's asking, it's a rhetorical question. Whose ox have I taken, or whose donkey have I taken, or whom have I defrauded? Who have I oppressed, or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? I will restore it to you. So he's asking, he's putting it out there, have I done any of these things? And verse 4 he says, And they said, You have not extorted us, or oppressed us, or taken anything from any man's hands. Everything that Saul's sons were doing and had done, Samuel is saying, I have not done these things, right? And as verse 5 he says, So he said to them, Yahweh is a witness against you, meaning that he's witnessing what I'm saying here, and he has anointed his witness this day that you have found nothing in my hand. And they said, He is witness. So they agreed with Samuel, saying that, no, you've judged rightly, and there's none of these things that you have done. So Samuel clears his name before Israel and before Yahweh, and he closes the chapter on his book of being judge. Right? Everything has been confirmed. So one last time, Samuel's going to do it one more time. And in verse 6, Samuel's going to judge. He's going to do his final judgment. And in verse 6, he says, Then Samuel said to the people, It is Yahweh who appointed Moses and Aaron, and who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt. And this is also in Psalm 99:6. You can look that up. But Samuel compares himself to Moses and Aaron. And Moses and Aaron were both priests and deliverer of Israel. And Samuel is saying, this is the last of the last, right? We're no more of these are happening. And verse 7, he goes, So now take your stand, that I may judge you before Yahweh concerning all the righteous acts of Yahweh, which he did for you and for your fathers. And he says, When Japheth went into Egypt, and your fathers cried out to Yahweh, then Yahweh sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of the land, out of Egypt, and settled them in this place. But they forgot Yahweh their God. So he sold them into the hand of Sisera, commander of the army of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. And they cried out to Yahweh and said, "We have sinned because we have forsaken Yahweh and have served the Baals and the Asherah. But now deliver us from our enemies, and we will serve you." Remember, this went on and on and on, and continuously went on. Verse 11, he says, "Then Yahweh sent Zerubbabel, Bedan, Japheth, and Samuel." And these were the judges, the time of the judges. "And he delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around, so that you lived in security. But you saw that Nahash, king of..." This is where we get to the reason for wanting a king. "But you saw that Nahash, the king of the sons of Ammon, came out against you, and you said to me, 'No, but a king shall reign over us, although Yahweh your God was king.'" So Nahash was the reason for their cry for a king, right? Nahash was the reason. We've seen, Israel constantly went through this process, right, of calling out for a deliverer, God delivering Israel, and then falling back into idolatry and falling back into sin, and this went on. But this wasn't God's purpose, right? What was God's purpose for Israel, right? Remember, what did God want to do in the Mosaic covenant? In the Mosaic covenant, he said, "If you will do this, then I will do this," right? Right? "If you walk in my ways and you obey my commandments, I will bless you. And if you don't, I will curse you," right? And so this, it wasn't God's fault. This is Israel's fault. This is Israel's, Israel's legacy of falling into sin. And in this case, we don't want to trust you, Yahweh. We want to trust our army. We want to be like the nations that are around us that have kings. So he says in verse 13, "So now behold the king whom you have chosen, whom you have asked for, and behold Yahweh has set a king over you." So now it's done. You have a king. Right? So it's like a courtroom. Saul defended himself. He's cleared his name, and he gives a brief history of Israel, and he shows them their constant disobedience. He went through this whole thing of disobedience, punishment, and deliverance, this whole thing that kept going on. And Samuel's the last one. He's the last deliverer who is not a king. And in verse 14, he warns Israel now. In verse 14, he says, "If you will fear Yahweh and serve him and listen to his voice and not rebel against the command of Yahweh." Not rebel against the command of Yahweh. If you will be obedient, right? If you will be obedient, then both you and also the king who reigns over you will follow Yahweh your God. And here we go, right? Remember this Mosaic covenant? We have this bilateral covenant. You have to meet this standard in order for me to bless you, right? This is that bilateral. You need to fulfill your end of the covenant. Verse 15 says, "But if you will not listen to the voice of Yahweh, but rebel against the command of Yahweh, then the hand of Yahweh will be against you as it was against your fathers." And we will see, right? Chapter 15 on, you'll see next week, that this was Saul's ultimate downfall. This was Saul's downfall. Do you remember ahead of time, we'll sneak in here, what did Samuel say to Saul? And what did Samuel tell Saul when Saul was sacrificing the animals that he was supposed to destroy? Remember what Samuel said when he came? To obey is better than sacrifice, right? What was Saul's problem? Right there. What was that? Yeah, pride. Yeah, but he wasn't obedient. Right, he wasn't obedient. Saul was not obedient. Initially he was, but his ultimate problem was disobedience. And this would be Saul's downfall, right? So these words would come back to haunt them. Saul's enemy would no longer be the Philistines, it would be Yahweh, right? Let me ask you a question. Do we fear men more than we fear God? Sometimes. We do that, don't we, right? Sometimes we fear men more than we fear God. What you'll see next week is that you're going to see that Saul feared men, right? They took all the good stuff and they kept the good stuff. They got rid of all the people, but they kept the king. And we're going to kind of mess around with him for a while, but they kept the good animals and all that. And Saul didn't want to take that away from them, so he let them sacrifice those animals against what God commanded, right? He didn't have to do that, but he did. And so Saul feared men more than he did God. And verse 16 says, "Even now take your stand and see this great thing which Yahweh will do before your eyes." So Yahweh responds to Israel's evil request for a king, and he does this with this display of nature. And this is what happens in verse 17. And he says, "Is it not the wheat harvest today?" So typically the priest would bless the harvest. And so Samuel is saying, "Is this not the wheat harvest today? I will call to Yahweh that he may send thunder and rain. Then you will know and see the wickedness is great which you have done in the eyes of Yahweh by asking for yourself a king." So Samuel called to Yahweh, and Yahweh sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared Yahweh and Samuel. Then all the people said to Samuel, "Pray for your servants to Yahweh your God, so that we may not die, for we have added to all our sins this evil by asking for ourselves a king." So this great thing that Yahweh that Samuel said Yahweh was going to do brought great fear upon the people. Right? God is showing them, that what you've done, I want you to understand. This is what you've done. And we saw this when Moses would go up to the mountain and the thunder, and we'd see, the glory of God on the mountain. The people had great fear, and the people feared God. In verse 20 it says, "Samuel said to the people, 'Do not fear. You have committed all this evil, yet do not turn aside from following Yahweh, but serve Yahweh with all your heart.'" Again, Yahweh's mercy comes back through, God's mercy. "And you must not turn aside, for then you would go after meaningless things which cannot profit and cannot deliver, because they are meaningless." Anybody know what he's talking about, those meaningless things that cannot profit or cannot deliver? Idol worship, yeah. That was worshiping idols and false gods, and that was Israel's downfall, right? Israel chased after the nations around them, the false gods of the nations around them. "For Yahweh," verse 22, "will not abandon his people on account of his great name, because Yahweh has been pleased to make you a people for himself." So we have this, verse 21 talks about these false worship, and in verse 22, he says, "For Yahweh will not abandon his people on account of" whose name? His great name, right? "Because Yahweh has been pleased to make you a people for himself." Right? What a great promise. What a great promise to Israel. And not only to Israel, but also by extension to us. Right? So ultimately, what does that tell us? That God's mercy isn't dependent upon whether I meet Yahweh's standards or whether I sin, but God's ultimate purpose and God's ultimate choosing depends on his unchangingness, his immutability, right? Remember going through God's attributes? Well, God is immutable. He doesn't change. And he made a covenant with Abraham, didn't he? Remember that? He made a covenant with Abraham, and that was what kind of covenant? Kind of covenant did God make with Abraham? A unilateral covenant, right? So meaning that all the fulfillment had to be done on one side, which was God's side. So it didn't matter who fulfilled the other part of that covenant. It was a unilateral covenant. Only God went through those animals. And even to this day, God has not fully abandoned Israel. His presence has left Jerusalem, but he has not abandoned Israel. And we know that one day he's going to come and he's going to restore Israel, and he's going to sit on the throne of David. In Jeremiah 32, chapter 32, verse 37 through 42, it says this, and listen to, and I'll kind of hit on the highlight of what is the main point of this, and it says, behold, and turn to Jeremiah 32, verse 37, it says, behold, I will gather them out of all the lands to which I have banished them in my anger and my wrath and in great indignation. God punished Israel, didn't he? God brought Israel into the land, and they, but he banished them in anger and wrath and in his indignation. He punished them. But he says, and I will cause them, but now he says, and I will cause them return to this place and make them inhabit it in safety. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. And I will give them one heart and one way, and they may fear me always for their own good and for the good of their children after them. Who is doing this? God is doing it, right? Israel's not doing this. God is doing this. And this hasn't happened yet. This is going to happen. And he says, and I will cut a covenant, an everlasting covenant with them. God has cut an everlasting covenant with Abraham. It goes all the way back to Abraham and God's promises to the people of Israel. And I will not turn away from them to do good to them, and I will put the fear of me in their hearts, so that they will not turn away from me, and I will rejoice over them to do them good, and will truly plant them in this land with all my heart and with all my soul. For thus says Yahweh, just as I brought all this great evil on this people, so I am going to bring on them all the good that I am promising them. God is going to fulfill this promise, right? And the age of the Gentiles is finished. Israel is going to go through a time of Jacob's trouble, a time of tribulation, and Israel is going to recognize who their Messiah was, right? The first time they didn't, but they're going to recognize him the second time, right? And how about for us? How about for us? When we sin, does God abandon us? He does, remember? Yeah, I remember what Chris Krob said. Was he here last week? Yeah, last week. Remember what he said? What did he say about God's abandoning? It fell on Jesus, right? Didn't it? Yep. And what did Jesus say on the cross? My God, why have you forsaken me, right? And so because Christ was forsaken, because Christ was abandoned for our sake, we're never going to be forsaken or abandoned, right? Verse 23, moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against Yahweh by ceasing to pray for you, but I will instruct you in the good and upright way. Samuel is ceasing to be a judge, but he's going to continue to be a prophet, or at this time they called him seers. He's going to continue to speak to Israel. So that office of Samuel is going to continue on. As God's priest today, this is I was pointing out to Jen, this is kind of as when counseling too, and how as believers, how we are to treat each other. In verse 23, Samuel said, moreover for me, far be it from me that I should sin against Yahweh by ceasing to pray for you. Right? We're to pray for each other, aren't we? We're to continuously pray for each other. Even we're supposed to pray for our enemies, aren't we? But I will instruct you in the good and upright way. Right? So Samuel models what believers are to do with each other, right? We're to pray for each other, and we're to disciple each other. And how do we disciple each other? How do we do that? Pray for one another. We come alongside them. We encourage them. We instruct them in the Word of God, right? Speaking truth to one another in love. Yep. Yeah, that's what we're doing. And this is, Samuel is a model of that. And today, we're priests for God, aren't we? We're God's priests today. 1 Peter 2:9 says, you are a chosen family, a what? A royal priesthood, right? A holy nation, a people for God's own possession. And what is our mission? What did he say our mission is? So that we, or you here, but we may proclaim the excellency of him who called us. Right? We're to proclaim the excellencies of Christ, aren't we? This is what we're here for. This is why we're the royal priesthood, because he called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. Right? Verse 24, he says, only fear Yahweh and serve him in truth with all your heart, for see what great things he has done for you. We're to remember what the great things God has done for us, huh? We're to serve him with all our heart and to remember, to recall what he has done for us. That's what we do every Sunday. We recall the things that God has done for us, haven't we? He has blessed us. But if you do wickedly, both you and your king will be swept away. Okay? So, their standard, though, was different. They lived under a bilateral covenant. They lived under the law. They never could meet the standard. Nobody could. And ultimately, of course, they would eventually fall, right? And we understand, too, that eventually Israel and Judah would eventually be swept away. Chapter 13. We might actually get through this. So, verse 1. Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 42 years over Israel. So he was one of the longer reigning kings of Israel. We don't know exactly how many years separates chapter 12 and chapter 13, but it's significant. So chapter 12, Saul was a young man, he was unmarried, and he's living in his father's house. Right? We get to chapter 13, he has a grown-up son named Jonathan. So we have probably somewhere at least 15 to 20 years gone by now. And in verse 2, he says, and Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel, of which 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, while 1,000 were with Jonathan, his son, at Gibeah of Benjamin. But he sent the rest of the people, each to his tent. So their actual standing army was pretty small. It was only 3,000. And the rest, which this is actually what the model Israel still follows to today. Their whole country is basically reserved for their military. You know, everybody in Israel has a machine gun in their home, right? And in this case, Israel hasn't changed much. They still have this standing army, but it's mostly reservists. And in verse 3, it says, and Jonathan struck the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah. I don't know if you remember last week we talked about that there was a hill near Saul's home where there was a Philistine outpost. And this is probably that outpost. So, you know, Scripture always has, you look at Scripture and it mentions those things and you go, why is that there? Well, there's usually a reason, because there's something that's going to be pointing to that later. And and this is probably what this is. And so in the Philistines, it goes on, it says, and Jonathan struck the garrison of the Philistines, which was in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it. Then Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. And so it's difficult to read this and go, what is he talking about here? Well, they never called themselves Hebrews. Saul would have never called his fellow Israelite a Hebrew. So the other nations around them would have called them Hebrews. So what Saul is probably referring to are these mercenaries and conscripts who were Israelites that were actually on the Philistine side. They were actually fighting for the Philistines. They were probably mercenaries for them. So he says, and let the Hebrews hear. So he's calling out to him. And we'll see this later, how this fits in. And in verse 4 he says, and then all Israel heard the news that Saul had struck the garrison of the Philistines. So all of Israel hears now. They know, we're stirred up the hornet's nest, right? And and even though it's credited to Saul, it was Jonathan who did it, and that's how it always went. It doesn't matter which general did it; the king is the one who gets the credit for it. So it's not different here. It says, then all Israel heard the news that Saul had struck the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become odious to the Philistines. So now they're mad, and the people are worried. So the people were then summoned to Saul at Gilgal. Now the Philistines assembled to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots. Now some take a little challenge with this, and they think that 30,000 is not even a realistic number. Some say it's 3,000, and so it depends on how it's interpreted. But there were a lot of chariots there. There were somewhere between 3,000 and 30,000 chariots there. And there's 6,000 horsemen, and it says, and the people like the sand which is on the seashore in abundance. So in other words, the Philistines had a big, big army, right? And Saul's army, standing army, was only 3,000. And they came up and camped in Michmash, east of Bethaven. Now the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait. In other words, they saw that they were in a bad position. They saw that they were hard pressed. They were in a dire situation. And the people hid themselves in the caves and the thickets and the cliffs, in cellars and in pits. That's what Israel would do. They would go hide in the hills, right? And they're actually going to do that. They're actually going to do that one day in the future. They're going to go run to the hills. So not only was Israel outnumbered, but the Philistines were also light years ahead of Israel in their metallurgy. They were way ahead of them in weapons making, and we're going to see this later. They were outnumbered and they were outarmed. In verse 7 it says, and also some of the Hebrews crossed the Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead. So here, these Hebrews that Saul had called crossed over the Jordan. So they probably came from they were in Ammon, in the area of Ammon. They might have been working for the Ammonites. He's calling all the people, all the Hebrews who were part of other armies, right? Who were mercenaries and conscripts in other armies. He was calling them, and apparently some of these Hebrews responded. And it says also some of the Hebrews crossed the Jordan in the land of Gad and Gilead, but as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. So they were really they were really freaked out about this. And verse 8 says, so he waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So he's awaiting this appointed time. The 7 days is this time of appointment that Samuel would have blessed the army. He would have blessed the army before battle. But Samuel didn't show up. And then the people they're getting more freaked out, and so he starts getting deserters. And in verse 9, so Saul said, bring near to me the burnt offering and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. So what did Saul do? Did he fear God? Who did he fear? He feared man, didn't he? He started to fear man. He put man above God. In verse 10, as soon as he finished the offering, of course, as soon as he did that, the burnt offering, behold, who shows up? Samuel does. And Saul went out to meet him and greet him, and he knew he's in trouble, didn't he? And verse 11 says, but Samuel said, what have you done? Kind of like David, you are that man, right? What have you done? So instead of waiting for Samuel to entreat favor from Yahweh like it was supposed to be, Saul takes it upon himself. He takes this authority upon himself, which he didn't possess. Saul is trying to do the job of Samuel the priest. And he gives 3 reasons for his actions, right? He says the people were scattering, his army was deserting him, Samuel was delayed, and the Philistines were assembling for battle. The Philistines were getting ready, and he's sitting there waiting, right? So, any one of us would have been pretty anxious in that situation, I think, right? And he says in verse 11, the last part of verse 11, he says, because I saw the people that they were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and the Philistines were assembling at Michmash. So he had all his excuses lined up. They were ready to go, right? On the surface, they seemed legitimate, but he acted on his circumstances. He acted on his fear of man instead of trusting God, right? Isn't that something we might do once in a while? Sometimes we get into dire circumstances and we look at our situation instead of looking towards God, huh? That's easy for us to do, isn't it? Huh? We do that. I think we probably do it a lot, all the time, We get in those situations, we need to trust God. Regardless, the Philistines could be surrounding us, Samuel is delayed, and my army is leaving me, right? I don't think we have anything like that in our lives that comes close to this, right? Verse 13, though, it's not good. And Samuel said to Saul, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you. For now Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. Isn't that interesting? God had already chosen David, but he said, I would have kept your kingdom forever. But he already had David in mind. God's providence that oversees all this is an amazing thing. Verse 14 says, "But now your kingdom shall not endure. Yahweh has sought out for himself a man after his own heart." Past tense. He already did that. "And Yahweh has appointed him as a ruler over his people because you have not kept what Yahweh commanded you." God had been preparing David since before time began. God has been preparing David as a shepherd and his battles with the bear and the lions and preparing David's heart for this time. Before Saul even was born, before Saul even did one sin, God had already prepared David. Isn't that amazing? He was already there. Saul's dynasty hasn't been deposed yet, Saul hasn't been deposed yet, but his dynasty is taken away. His son, Prince Jonathan, he'll never be king. The man who'd be king would be someone who was after Yahweh's own heart and someone who would keep his commands. Do you know who David really represents? David really represents God's chosen people. He represents us in many ways, doesn't he? You know, nobody under the law could ever keep the law, could they? I mean, Saul could never keep it. Saul could never do that. I don't care how good a man he was, and we saw that he was a good man, right? He was a good man. God chose him, but he could never keep the law. He could never be fully obedient, could he? But there was a man that God had chose, and this was a man after his own heart. And he was after God's own heart because God is the one who changed his heart. Right? He would keep God's commands for the most part. But he's very comparable to us, isn't he? He was a man of sin. He met David. Speaking of David, he committed great sins, didn't he? But he was a man after God's own heart because God changed his heart. God prepared him for that moment. And, God chose him, and he was obedient. You know the reason why we're obedient? The only reason why we're chosen and we're obedient is because God has changed our hearts, right? And the fruit of the Spirit is not the fruit of Ben. It's not the fruit of you. It's the fruit of the Spirit, isn't it? God is the one who works in us. In verse 15, some troop movements here. Then Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. That is pretty thin, isn't it? And now Saul and his son Jonathan and people were present with him, were staying in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the Philistines camped at Michmash. And the raiders came up from the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned toward Oprah to the land of Shaul, and another company turned toward Bethhorn, and another company turned toward the way of the border, which overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. If you look on a map, basically you have these massive troop movements coming up against 600 guys here. And the situation couldn't look more dire. Well, it actually gets worse. Go to verse 19. Verse 19 says, "Now no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel." No blacksmith could be found. Do you know where the Israelis had to get their blacksmithing done? Keep reading. "For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make swords or spears." And at verse 20 it says, "So all of Israel went to the Philistines," and this was in the past, to sharpen his plowshare, his mattocks, his axe, and his goad. Israel had to go to the Philistines because the Philistines knew how to work with iron. They were Iron Age people. They were a generation past Israel. They knew how to work with iron. Israel didn't even have any blacksmiths. And so they had to depend on the Philistines just to make their farming implements and to sharpen them for them. So of course in a time of war they're not going to do that. They're not going to supply them weapons. They're not going to supply them blacksmiths. And verse 21 says, "And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshare, the mattocks, the forks, the axes, and to fix the goad. And so it happened on the day of the battle that neither sword nor spear was found in the hand of any of the people." Right? None of the people had a sword. None of the people had a spear. You know what they had? They had pitchforks. They had farming implements. That's all they had. They were fighting an army that was much bigger, much more powerful, probably much better trained. Right? and they had weapons. It'd be like going against somebody with your knife and they've got, a machine gun, right? It'd be like that situation. Yeah, well, so, yeah, that's how David fought, right? And even all the way into David's time, they fought like that too. They didn't have weapons. Even when he's starting at David's time, it took a long time for them to get those weapons. Yeah, yeah, pitchfork will do damage, but I wouldn't want to fight against somebody with a sword or a spear with it. Yeah. There's a modern example of this. It's kind of interesting, but there's a modern example of this. The Okinawan people, they used to fight. They would fight with their farming implements. They had what they called sais. They used to, and the thing which Bruce Lee made famous, his nunchucks, right? That was a farming implement. They would go around and spin that, and that's how they used to to shake the, I think it was the wheat and their grains. They would use that to farm with, and they also had a three-pronged fork, and that's what they used to hook into the oxen's ring and pull them, and that ended up being a fighting instrument. So they could act. If you're seeing Okinawan use that stuff, I would be pretty scared of them, right? So they learned how to adapt to it, but this wasn't a good situation. So let me read 22 again. So it happened on that day of the battle that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and his son Jonathan. So two people and the whole army of 600 of Israel had actual weapons, right? That's what Israel faced. That's what Israel had to go against, and you're going to see that next week. Okay? Pretty amazing, and it struck me that Saul failed under some really dire circumstances, things that I have never faced before, and Saul failed, didn't he? He failed at those things. I'm so glad I don't live under the old covenant. I'm so glad I don't live under the law, because I'm pretty sure that I'm pretty sure looking at all of this that I probably would have caved in. I know I would. I mean, it would have been a situation that no man in his natural state could ever face, right? The challenge would be too great. That even shows more that God is the one who he's in control of everything, isn't he? God is the one. He is the one that defends us. He's the one that protects us. He is the one who has delivered us. He is our deliverer. And we really, this is just a worldly example, right? God has done way more than this for us, hasn't he? Man. All right. Any questions on that? Oh. Go ahead, Dean. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, it wasn't demanded. It wasn't demanded on them like it was with the king. Yeah, when the king came there, then it was, you don't have a choice, right? And that's what Samuel warned them. They were no longer a volunteer army. They were conscripted, right? And that was one of the big changes that occurred. Yeah. What's that? Yeah. Well, yeah, you don't, because you get your head lopped off. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about if David was ultimately God's choice
Uh huh.
king. What was this interim period with Saul, and he chose Saul?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
You know, I it's you look at the big picture and you see that God's plan is from beginning to end, His providence, and we just see such a picture of, I think for us too, because we know Paul said that the Old Testament was written for our benefit, right? It was written for our benefit, and we see this picture of God's hand upon two different men. And I would venture to argue that David's sin was even greater than Saul's. If you look at David's life, man, murder, adultery, trying to cover it up, those kind of things. David was I mean, but David repented. David repented. And when you go on to see this, you'll see that Saul repented to Samuel. You know, he's told Samuel, you know, forgive me, Samuel. You know, so it's not clear that Saul ever repented to God. It's probably because his heart wasn't changed and he couldn't, you know. And repentance ultimately comes from God also. Repentance is another gift that God gives us, that we're able to repent. And yeah, we just see this real picture, you know, of, I think David is a future picture to me. It appears as a future picture of the new covenant. And David was always selected to be the throne that our Lord would sit on, right? He would sit on the throne of David, and David forever was the throne that was the kingdom that was to be established forever, right? His throne would last forever. But it's kind of interesting because it says right here that Saul, I would have kept your kingdom. It would have gone on, you know. It's so, you know, the Bible is so much about God's providence, and yet still there's man's responsibility that's involved in this, right? Saul is still responsible. Saul is responsible, isn't he? You know, and that's same with us. We're responsible for our actions, not God. We are responsible for it. But it's just such a beautiful picture that David was the one whom God prepared for that position. Any other questions? All right. Well, we're out of time. So thank you. Appreciate it. We got through it. So hopefully we're caught up, I think.